My husband took me to the forest and left me there in a wheelchair. He didn't want to share money and property with me during the divorce. My name is Grace. I'm 33, and up until last year, I would have said my life was pretty much perfect. I had a thriving interior design business based in Seattle, a husband who was the poster child of entrepreneurial success, and a little two-story house in the suburbs that practically looked like it had been built for Instagram. My feed was full of snapshots, coffee in hand, lights streaming through the gauzy living room curtains I'd picked out myself, a cozy reading nook by the fireplace, my husband Jason hugging me from behind while I pretended to be surprised. You know the vibe. But all that changed in 1 second. One sharp, brutal second. It was mid-September, just before the fall rush when clients start freaking out about hosting holidays. I was driving back from a meeting with a new client in Bellevue, running on too much cold brew and not enough food. The roads were slick from that annoying Seattle drizzle that never really stops. I was listening to a voice memo I'd recorded about color palettes for a coastal-themed sunroom when I saw the headlights. That's all I remember. I woke up 2 days later in a hospital bed with my mouth dry as sandpaper and a 1,000-pound weight sitting on my chest. Jason was there, holding my hand, but his face looked hollow. I could tell immediately something was wrong, but I couldn't quite place it. I tried to move, but my legs didn't respond. It was like they weren't part of me anymore. The doctor came in not long after. I don't remember his name, just the way he avoided eye contact when he said spinal cord injury and paralysis, and we don't know if it's permanent. Jason squeezed my hand so hard I thought he might break it. The days after that were a blur of painkillers, physical therapy consults, awkward visits from people who didn't know what to say, and crying. Lots of crying. For me, mostly. But Jason, too. Sometimes, though always when he thought I was asleep. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital and another month in a rehab center, learning how to live in a wheelchair. Showering, dressing, even transferring myself from the chair to the bed was a nightmare. I went from being an independent business owner who designed dream spaces for people to someone who needed help opening a damn jar of peanut butter. When I finally came home, everything fell off. Jason had rearranged the furniture to make it easier for me to move around, but the space didn't feel like mine anymore. I'd poured years into making that house feel like us, and now it just felt like a hospital in disguise. At first, Jason tried. He really did. He'd wheel me around the park near our place, cook dinner, even tried to help me with clients remotely when I couldn't go on site. But I could see it wearing on him. The way he hesitated before helping me out of the car. The way he flinched when he thought I was going to ask for something. It wasn't anger. It was exhaustion, and that might have been worse. A month after I got home, I caught him crying in the garage, sitting on the cold floor with his head in his hands. He didn't see me. I didn't make a sound. But I watched him for a long time. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. He didn't want this life. Not really. Not anymore. And honestly, neither did I. The first real crack showed up during a conversation about Thanksgiving. I was trying to brainstorm a small dinner I could manage from my chair, and Jason interrupted me mid-sentence. Grace, maybe we should just go to my mom's this year. We hadn't spent a holiday with his mom in 5 years. She lives in Boise and doesn't like city people or the way I don't use real butter in my cooking. I blinked at him. Okay, I said, trying not to sound hurt. Will you go without me? Or, no, I mean you should come. I'll figure out the accessibility stuff. I just think it'd be good for you to see people. Translation, he didn't want to do this with me here. We didn't go to Boise. I ended up eating microwave stuffing and a rotisserie chicken in front of the TV, while Jason sat in the other room, taking work calls. By Christmas, he wasn't sleeping in our bed anymore. Claimed the guest room was closer to the Wi-Fi router for late-night Zoom calls. I didn't argue. I'd lost the energy to fight for things. By February, my business had completely stalled. Clients had moved on. My assistant quit. My inbox was a graveyard of just checking in emails that I couldn't bring myself to answer. I was too embarrassed to tell anyone I couldn't physically do the work anymore. Jason didn't ask. Not once. And last week, this is the part that still doesn't feel real. I found a hotel receipt in the laundry. It was for a Hyatt downtown. 1 night. Room service charges. 1 breakfast. 2 meals. I didn't say anything. I haven't confronted him. Maybe I don't need to. There's a part of me that already knows what happened. And the saddest part? I'm not even angry. I'm just tired. So tired. I thought the accident would be the hardest part of all this. But it wasn't. The hardest part has been watching my life unravel in slow motion. Watching the man who promised to love me through anything slowly drift away. Watching my identity shrink down to a chair and a body that won't cooperate. I used to design homes. Now I can't even leave mine without help. At first, I thought Jason was handling things better than I was. He came to every physical therapy session, asked all the right questions, posted supportive captions on Instagram like, My wife is the strongest woman I know, complete with photos of me smiling from a hospital bed, my hair brushed and makeup done just enough to make it seem like I wasn't falling apart inside. Everyone in our circle commented things like goals and what a team. And for a while, I let myself believe it. But at home, when there were no therapists watching, no friends commenting, it was different. He started sighing a lot. Little things at first. Helping me into the shower, lifting my legs onto the couch, cleaning up after I spilled a glass of water because I couldn't steady my grip. The sighs turned into silence, then into tension. I remember one night about a month after I came home, I asked him if he could help me transfer from the chair to the bed. It was late, I was tired, and I could barely feel my hands from pushing myself around all day. He came into the room, jaw clenched, and said nothing as he helped me. But when I leaned into him and accidentally bumped his shoulder too hard, he snapped. Jesus, Grace. Can you just try not to lean so much? My back is killing me. I didn't say anything, just looked away and nodded. But something in me cracked. It only got worse from there. He stopped looking at me when we talked. I'd be telling him about the new exercises my physical therapist gave me, and he'd be scrolling through his phone, nodding like he was listening but clearly checked out. We stopped having dinner together. I'd eat in the kitchen while he stayed in his office, claiming he had work. The only time we really shared space anymore was when he was wheeling me into or out of the car for appointments. And then the bills started piling up. Even with insurance, the costs were brutal. The wheelchair alone was almost $6,000, and the home modifications weren't cheap either. He didn't say anything outright at first, just left the envelopes unopened on the counter or muttered things like another one under his breath when he saw a new invoice. I caught him one evening in the living room with his laptop open, calculator pulled up, and a spreadsheet on the screen. He didn't see me at first, and I heard him muttering, "We can't keep doing this." When I asked what he meant, he looked startled, like a kid caught doing something wrong. "Nothing," he said quickly, "just sorting through expenses." Later that night, as he helped me into bed, he said it, quietly, almost like he was talking to himself, but I heard it clear as day. "This is not what I signed up for." I froze. I didn't say anything. I didn't even breathe for a second. He noticed, of course, and like always, he tried to walk it back. "I didn't mean it like that," he added, too quickly. "I'm just tired. It's been a long day." But I knew exactly what he meant. It wasn't just a long day. It was every day. Every moment since the accident had become something heavy and unwelcome. He had married someone vibrant, active, full of energy and independence. And now, he was stuck with someone who couldn't get into bed without help, who couldn't climb the stairs, who needed assistance getting dressed some mornings. He didn't sign up for this. He never said it again out loud, but I heard it in everything after that. When he rolled his eyes as I asked him to adjust my position on the couch. When he left the room mid-conversation because his phone rang, and it was important. When he started spending more nights away, claiming he had networking events or late meetings downtown. Even the way he hugged me changed. It used to be full, arms tight around me like he meant it. Now it was more of a pat, like you'd give a friend in passing. I told myself he was grieving in his own way, that it was hard for him too, that maybe he just needed time. But deep down I knew he was still here because he didn't know how to leave without looking like the villain. So instead, he just disappeared in place, pulled away inch by inch until I was left sitting in a home that didn't feel like mine anymore, with a man who barely looked at me, both of us pretending like this was still a marriage. It started innocently enough. About 4 months after the accident, Jason came into the bedroom one afternoon while I was replying to emails on my tablet, struggling to keep up with a client who had started getting restless about delayed timelines. My hands were trembling from fatigue, and my lower back was killing me from sitting in the chair too long, but I was pushing through it. I still had a business, and I wasn't ready to let that go. Jason sat down on the edge of the bed, his tone unusually gentle. "You know," he said, "you don't have to do this all on your own. At least not right now. You should be focusing on your recovery. You've got nothing to prove." I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the screen, the blinking cursor in the empty reply field. The truth was, I'd already missed 2 deadlines and had been avoiding calls from my accountant for days. I wasn't sure if I was proving anything anymore, or just holding on to something I couldn't manage. Jason continued, leaning in like he'd already made up his mind. "What if I took over, just for a little while? I could handle the day-to-day, respond to clients, delegate the smaller stuff. It'll give you room to breathe. We don't want you burning out before you've even fully recovered." The way he said, "we" made me pause. But I was too tired to push back, and I told myself it was temporary. I handed over my laptop that same evening, gave him all the logins, and wrote a short announcement email to our core clients saying that due to health reasons, Jason would be stepping in as acting director for the next few months. I signed it with a shaky hand, trying not to think too much about it. At first, it seemed like he was actually trying. He cleaned up the project list, reached out to vendors, scheduled meetings. He even CC'd me on everything so I wouldn't feel left out. But gradually, things began to shift. I noticed fewer emails coming to me directly. I stopped being invited to design reviews. Clients stopped calling my phone. One day, I asked about a longtime client of mine, Marissa, who had a major kitchen renovation pending. Jason shrugged. Oh, she wanted something more modern farmhouse, and I figured Bella would be a better fit for the vibe. She's been handling it. Bella? I asked. New assistant, he said casually. She's great. Super sharp. You'll love her. The first time I met her, she came by the house for a quick drop-off, though I later realized she had a key. She was tall, maybe mid-20s, with sleek dark hair, oversized sunglasses, and that effortless look people seem to pull off when they've never worked a day with a bad back or a budget. She was nice, sure. Too nice. Always smiling, always cheerful, calling Jason J. like they were old friends. She spoke to me slowly, like I was a grandparent on FaceTime for the first time. I let it go. I told myself not to overthink it. But Bella started showing up more often. At first, she'd come by a few times a week for work. Then it was daily. Then weekends. She'd bring coffee, laugh at Jason's jokes, stay late to finish things up, and eventually just stopped leaving. Her jacket was the first thing I noticed hanging on the hook by the front door. Then a pair of heels under the hall bench. Then a laptop charger plugged into the wall next to the couch. Once, I wheeled into the kitchen and found her pouring herself wine. She looked up, startled, and said, "Oh, I didn't think you'd be up." I wanted to scream, but I said nothing. Meanwhile, the business was moving forward, without me. Jason stopped including me in client meetings. When I asked why, he said I should be resting, that I didn't need to worry about stress right now. I told him I wasn't sick. I was paralyzed. There's a difference. That didn't go over well. Eventually, I couldn't even access my own company's accounts. Passwords were changed for security, I was told. A check came in from a commercial client I'd worked with for over a year, and I had no idea we'd even finished the job. When I asked Jason about it, he said, it was a minor update, nothing you needed to get involved in. I wanted to believe he still saw me as capable, but everything around me said otherwise. The house, once mine, had become a rotating workspace for a business I no longer controlled. My studio had been rearranged without my input. Files were gone. Mood boards I'd painstakingly crafted were buried in folders I couldn't even find anymore. I was still breathing, still here, but it was like I'd been slowly erased from my own life. I tried bringing it up once, gently, without anger. We were in bed, or at least I was, and Jason was scrolling on his phone. I asked him if he thought maybe it was time I took on some of the design work again. Nothing big, just a small project, something to ease back in. He didn't even look at me. Let's just keep things the way they are for now, he said, still tapping away. It's working. For him, maybe. But for me, nothing was working. I'd lost my legs, yes, but I was also losing my voice, my work, my name on the door. And the woman who now practically lived in my home, the one calling my husband Jay and using my coffee mugs like they were hers, she was gaining everything I was being quietly pushed out of. And Jason? He didn't even notice. Or maybe he did. Maybe he noticed everything. The silence came slowly, not all at once. At first, it was just a few missed texts, friends who used to message every day now taking longer to respond. Then it was plans being canceled at the last minute, or worse, not being made at all. I'd scroll through Instagram and see group dinners, birthdays, weekend getaways, faces I knew, inside jokes I used to be part of, and realize I hadn't even been invited. The captions always said things like, much needed catch up, or finally reunited. And I'd sit there wondering what I'd done wrong, until I remembered. I hadn't done anything. I just stopped being able to climb stairs. One afternoon, I overheard a phone call Jason was having with someone. I think it was his sister, or maybe a client. It's hard to tell now. He was pacing through the hallway, didn't realize I was nearby. He said, she's not the same, you know? It's just hard. People don't know what to say around her. And then, quietly, I don't even know what to say anymore. It wasn't just him. I'd heard it before. Little comments when people thought I couldn't hear. It's awkward. I don't want to make her feel uncomfortable. It's just so sad. Like my presence was a burden. Like I was the shadow of someone they used to love. The few friends who did still visit treated me like I might break. Their voices went up in pitch, like they were talking to a child, asking me over and over again if I needed water, or a blanket, or anything at all. Just let them know. And then they'd look around the room, their eyes not quite meeting mine, and leave early, promising to stop by again soon. But they didn't. The visits stopped altogether after a while. I tried calling a few of them, left messages, even just funny memes to try and keep a thread of connection alive. Most went unanswered. A few responded with "so sorry, been crazy busy," and nothing else. Jason, at least in the beginning, made an effort to fill in the gaps. He'd sit with me during dinner, make some half-hearted conversation about work, ask if I'd done my exercises. But over time, even that faded. He started eating alone more often, claiming he had too many late meetings. Clients on the East Coast, he'd say. They work weird hours. Some nights, he didn't come home at all. Just sent a text saying he was sleeping at the office to finish a proposal. Once, I called him at midnight, and it went straight to voicemail. When I asked him about it the next day, he shrugged. Battery died. You know how it is. But I didn't. I didn't know how it was, because I hadn't left the house in over a week. The house itself, once filled with music, laughter, the smell of candles and fresh bread and eucalyptus, now felt like a museum. My studio, the heart of my creativity, had become a storage room filled with unused materials and dusty fabric samples. I used to love rearranging the living room every few weeks, just for the fun of it. Now I couldn't even move a cushion without help. The kitchen, once a space of creation, was something I wheeled past on my way to the bedroom, unable to reach half the cabinets anymore. Even the dog started following Jason more than me. And the intimacy, if you could even call it that, disappeared completely. We hadn't touched in weeks. No hugs, no kisses, not even a brush of hands. When I asked him once if he still found me attractive, he looked at me like I'd asked if the sky was green. Grace, he said, this isn't about that. But he didn't say yes. And that said everything. We stopped talking about anything real. Our conversations became transactional. Can you grab my charger? Did the delivery come? I scheduled your appointment for Thursday. There was no warmth, no curiosity, just tasks. Tasks and silence. The nights were the worst. I used to love evenings, wine on the couch, bad reality shows, the occasional spontaneous dance party in the kitchen. Now, the house turned cold and cavernous after dark. Jason would be gone, or locked in his office with the door closed. I'd lie in bed listening to the clock tick, the occasional sound of a car outside, and feel like I was underwater. Breathing, but just barely. There were days I didn't speak to another human being at all. The house I had poured my soul into designing had become a cage. A beautiful, expensive, tastefully curated prison. And inside it, I was fading, bit by bit, while the world just kept moving without me. It had been a quiet morning, like most of them were by then. I had finished the same breakfast I had every day, instant oatmeal, a banana, and black coffee, and was sitting by the window in the living room, watching condensation gather and slide down the glass like tired little rivers. The rain was soft, almost mist-like, and I remember thinking how much I used to love days like that. Back when I'd throw on boots and a scarf and wander around the city just to feel the weight of the sky. My phone buzzed on the side table. I almost didn't look at it. No one texted me anymore. But it was Jason. There's a surprise tonight, the message said. Dress warmly. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. It didn't feel real. He hadn't sent me a message like that in over a year. No emojis. No follow-up. Just that. I reread it 5 or 6 times, my heart starting to thump in a way it hadn't in months. I ran through every possible meaning. A surprise. What kind of surprise? And why now? After all the silence, the long nights alone, the quiet disappearance of our life together, why this message? Still, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Hope. Ridiculous, shaky, soft-bellied hope. I spent the rest of the afternoon getting ready, which took longer than it used to. Everything did now. I chose a thick cream sweater, the one with the wide sleeves and the high neck that I hadn't worn since before the accident. It still smelled faintly of cedar. I added a wool scarf and a gray beanie, then sat in front of the mirror and tried to remember how to make myself look like someone who believed in new beginnings. Just a little mascara, a bit of color on my cheeks. I didn't want to overdo it, but I couldn't help it. I wanted to look like someone he'd want to see again. By 6 o'clock, I was ready, sitting by the door, waiting. He hadn't given me a time. Just tonight. My chair batteries were fully charged. My coat was folded across my lap. I had a small bag with gloves, tissues, and a charger just in case. The kind of preparation I never used to need. He walked in around 7:30, hair damp from the rain, coat slung over his shoulder. He looked surprised to see me ready. Wow, he said. You look nice. I smiled, trying to keep my voice steady. So what's the surprise? He glanced at his phone. It's outside. Come on. We didn't talk much as he wheeled me out to the car. He lifted me gently, the way he used to. His hands felt strong but careful, like he was remembering. He had brought blankets for the car, even tucked one around my legs without me asking. I tried not to read into it, but my chest felt tight the whole drive. It wasn't far, maybe 20 minutes out of the city. I started recognizing the route. The turnoff near the old state park where we used to hike in the fall, when the leaves were still amber and gold. My breath caught in my throat. We pulled up to a clearing just off the road, a wide gravel lot that overlooked the valley. It was dark, but the clouds had cleared, and the sky above us was full of stars. There was a fire pit lit in the distance, glowing amber in the cold night. 2 camping chairs were set up beside it, and a thick plaid blanket was draped over one of them. Jason parked the car and helped me out slowly, no rush, no sighs. He wrapped another blanket around my shoulders, then rolled me over to the fire. The night was cold, but not bitter. The flames flickered high enough to warm my face. "I remembered you always loved it out here," he said. "Thought you might want to see the stars again." For a while, we just sat there, not speaking, watching the sky. The fire crackled and the wind rustled through the trees, and I felt like I had stepped out of time. Like maybe, just maybe, we were finding our way back. Maybe he was trying. Maybe this was the start of something. The next morning, he was already up before me, which was unusual. I heard him moving around in the kitchen, and then the quiet creak of the front door opening and closing. When he came back in, his hair was still damp from the shower, and he had that familiar leather travel bag slung over one shoulder. The one he used to take on business trips. "I thought we could take a little drive," he said casually, like it was something we did all the time. "Get out of the city. Clear our heads." I hesitated. "Where?" He smiled, not quite meeting my eyes. "You'll see. Just pack something warm." I didn't have the energy to ask questions. And honestly, after the night before, something in me wanted to hold on to whatever this was. Maybe this was him trying. Maybe it was one last attempt to salvage what was left. I packed light. Layers, medications, my charger, and a small book I hadn't touched in months. He loaded everything into the back of the SUV while I waited at the door, coat zipped up, gloves already on. As he helped me into the passenger seat, I noticed he'd laid out an extra cushion and the seat heater was already on. He'd even brought a thermos of tea. Everything felt thoughtful, intentional. We pulled onto the highway just before 10. The sky was overcast, thick clouds pressing down like they were trying to flatten the world. Jason had a playlist running, soft indie music I didn't recognize, but it wasn't unpleasant. For a while, we didn't speak much. I watched the trees blur past, gray and brown and green, still dripping from the early rain. The further we got from the city, the quieter it became inside the car. Around the 3rd hour, I noticed the GPS was off. I glanced at him. "Where are we going?" He didn't look at me, just kept his eyes on the road and said, "Trust me." That should have comforted me, but it didn't. The trees started getting denser, taller. Old-growth forest with branches that curved down like arms, heavy with moss. I knew we were near the edge of the national park, but I didn't recognize this road. It wasn't the main entrance. No signs. No parked cars. Just endless forest and a narrow 2-lane road that twisted through it like a vein. I adjusted my coat and tried to shift in my seat, but the harness strap was stiff, tied across my lap. I looked back briefly. My suitcase was still there, tucked neatly in the corner, beside what looked like another duffel I didn't remember packing. Jason turned off the music, rolled the window down a crack. The air pouring in was cold and sharp, full of pine and damp soil. He finally said something after almost 30 minutes of silence. "You remember that camping trip we took before we got married?" I nodded slowly. "Mount Rainier. You forgot the tent poles." He laughed once under his breath. "Yeah, you were so mad at me." I smiled despite myself. "You tried to rig the tarp with bungee cords and a stick. It collapsed in the middle of the night. I still think it was a solid attempt." We both laughed, briefly, but it didn't last. The silence returned quickly, thick and uneven. The road narrowed again, the asphalt turning to gravel. I felt every bump through the seat. Jason gripped the steering wheel tighter. His knuckles were pale. I glanced at him. "Jason, seriously, where are we going?" He didn't answer at first, just kept driving. His jaw was clenched, and I saw the way his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror more than once. Finally, without looking at me, he said, "It's a place I found. You'll see." His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. Not excitement, not anticipation. Something else. Something that made my chest feel tight. I looked out the window. The forest was thicker now. No buildings. No cabins. No cell towers. Just trees and sky and the long, endless road ahead of us. The SUV rolled to a slow stop on a dirt pull-off barely wider than the vehicle itself. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, and beyond the windshield, nothing but a wall of trees loomed. Tall, unmoving, thick with moss and silence. Jason cut the engine, and the hum of the heater died, replaced by the sudden, eerie stillness of the forest. He didn't say anything at first, just opened his door, stepped out, and walked around to the back. I sat there, staring ahead, trying to make sense of what was happening. I waited for him to open my door like he usually did, or say something. Anything. But instead, I heard the hatch click open. When I twisted in my seat to look behind me, I saw him pulling out my wheelchair. He set it down on the gravel, then grabbed the small, overnight bag I'd packed, followed by a blanket, a flashlight, and a single bottle of water. He placed everything on the ground beside the chair like he was setting up a display. I opened the door myself, my hands already cold from the air. "Jason?" I asked, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. "What is this?" He didn't look at me, just adjusted the blanket one last time, then stood up straight and finally met my eyes. "I can't do this anymore," he said. I didn't understand at first. I thought maybe he meant the trip, or the road, or something practical. Do what? His face didn't change. This. All of it. The pretending. The caretaking. The waiting around for something to feel normal again when it never will. "Grace, I've tried." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What are you talking about? What are you doing?" He took a step back, shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "This isn't life. Not for me. Not really. I feel like I'm suffocating. Every day, I wake up, and I'm not even a person anymore. I'm your nurse, your driver, your errand boy." I shook my head, the cold biting at my ears. "So you're leaving me? Out here? I thought about doing it at home," he said, like that was some kind of mercy. "But you'd have called someone. You always do. And then it would have been drama. I need a clean break." I stared at him, every nerve in my body screaming. "You brought me here to abandon me." He flinched like the word hit him. "I left the essentials. You've got water. The flashlight works. And it's not going to freeze tonight. Someone will come down this road eventually. A ranger, maybe." I looked it up. "You looked it up?" I said, my voice breaking. "Like you were researching how to get rid of me." He didn't answer. Just stood there, jaw tight, eyes blank. "I gave you everything," I whispered. "You had my name on your business cards. You slept in my bed. You used my home, my money, my love. And now you're just leaving me here." He looked away, then back. "You're dragging me down, Grace. I know that sounds cruel, but it's the truth. I can't be who I want to be with you like this. I've tried to convince myself otherwise, but I'm done lying. I need my life back." I was shaking, not from fear, not yet, but from rage. Pure and cold. "You coward." He didn't respond. Just walked back to the driver's side, opened the door, and slid in without another word. I watched as the brake lights flared red against the trees, then faded into darkness as the car pulled away, gravel kicking up behind it. No headlights stayed behind. No goodbye. Just me. Alone. The trees closed in around me, silent and unblinking. The only sounds were the rustle of wind through the branches and my own breath, sharp and uneven, in the cold night air. I didn't see him that morning. I didn't even know he was in town. But later, much later, I would learn that Alex had been there. He saw everything. Well, not everything, but enough. It turns out he'd been staying at his cousin's cabin, just off the old service road that runs along the edge of the state park. He'd come back from Iraq a few months earlier and was taking time off, trying to readjust. The way he described it later, he was walking his cousin's dog through the woods when he saw the SUV. My SUV. He recognized it immediately, even after all these years. Said it was the way Jason was acting that caught his attention. Apparently, Jason was looking around too much. Kept checking the rearview mirror. Got out of the car too slowly, like he wasn't sure he wanted to do what he was about to do. Alex told me he saw Jason lift me from the car. He hadn't realized it was me at first, and the way my head rested against his shoulder must have looked tender to anyone else, but not to him. He said something about Jason's posture was off. Like the care wasn't genuine. Like he was performing something for himself, not for the woman in his arms. Alex had always had good instincts. Even in college, he could spot bullshit before most people finished their sentences. He stayed back, hidden just beyond the tree-line. Watched Jason unload the wheelchair, the bag, the blanket, the flashlight. Watched the way he didn't linger. Watched the way he didn't look back. And then he watched the SUV pull away, leaving me behind. He didn't move at first. Thought maybe Jason was coming back. Maybe he'd just gone to get something. Maybe it was just temporary. But the car didn't return. That's when he started walking. I didn't know any of this, of course. I was still sitting in the middle of nowhere, in a chair that suddenly felt like an anchor. The forest was growing darker by the minute. I'd wrapped the blanket around my legs, trying to keep my hands from going numb, but I could already feel the dampness settling in. My breath came out in little clouds, and even though I was furious and humiliated and terrified, I told myself over and over not to cry. Not out here. Not alone. That was when I heard the crunch of boots. At first I thought it was an animal. My heart jumped into my throat, and I gripped the flashlight, which suddenly felt more like a toy than a tool. The sound came closer, measured and slow. Not rushed, not panicked. And then a voice. Familiar, steady, unmistakably real. Grace. I froze. I hadn't heard that voice in years. A name I hadn't said out loud in over a decade. When I turned toward the sound, he stepped out from between the trees, hands raised slightly, his face half lit by the fading sky. It was Alex. Older now, broader in the shoulders, more weathered in the eyes, but still him. "It's me," he said. "You're okay. I've got you." For the first time since Jason left, I let my breath go. He didn't ask questions right away. He didn't waste time with shock or outrage. He just moved. One moment he was stepping out of the trees. The next he was beside me, pulling off his pack and laying it on the ground. "You're freezing," he said, unzipping the bag and pulling out a thermal blanket that looked like something from a military survival kit. It was silver-lined and stiff and made that crackling sound as he unfolded it, but it was warm. He draped it around my shoulders, tucking it tight, then crouched in front of me and looked me in the eyes. "What happened?" he asked, not like someone looking for gossip, but like someone who needed the facts before making a plan. "Jason," I said, barely recognizing my own voice. "He just left." I saw something shift in Alex's face. Not surprise, not even anger, just focus, like a wire had been pulled tight inside him, and now everything in him was honed in one direction. "I saw him drive off," he said. "Didn't like the way it looked. I was already on my way when I heard you." He didn't say anything about what kind of man does that. He didn't curse or promise revenge. He just gently reached behind me, checked the position of the chair, and said, "I'm not wheeling you out of here in this terrain. I'm going to carry you. It's not far." I didn't argue. I couldn't. My arms were shaking too hard, and my legs felt like dead weight in the cold. I nodded once, and before I knew it, he had slid one arm beneath my knees, the other around my back, and lifted me in one smooth motion. He was still strong, maybe even stronger than I remembered. His chest was warm, his breath steady, and every step he took was sure and even, like he'd rehearsed this 100 times. The trees closed in behind us as he carried me through the narrow trail. I could smell wood smoke before I saw the cabin, low and square, half hidden behind the brush, with light spilling through the windows like something out of a memory I hadn't let myself revisit. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. The heat hit me first, then the scent of pine, worn leather, and the faint tang of coffee. Everything about the space was simple: bare wood walls, a fireplace with a slow-burning log, a rack of boots by the door, a folded map on the table with a compass beside it. No clutter, no noise. Just calm. He set me gently on a low couch near the fire, knelt beside me, and unwrapped the damp blanket. "I'll get you something dry," he said, "and tea, or soup, whatever I can warm up." He moved with quiet urgency, not panic. Every motion deliberate. It was strange, being held by someone I hadn't seen in over 10 years, and yet feeling, for the first time in months, completely safe. I watched him as he filled a kettle, lit the burner, and pulled a flannel shirt from a chest near the wall. I hadn't asked him why he was here, or what he'd seen over there, or why he disappeared after college. But I didn't need to. Not in that moment. He came back to the couch, helped me out of my coat, then wrapped the dry shirt around me like a second skin. "You're going to be okay," he said quietly. And for the first time since the accident, I actually believed it. My hands were still trembling when he wrapped them in a dry towel, pressing gently to warm them up. The fire crackled beside us, casting soft gold light against the walls, and everything smelled like cedar and steam. Alex moved with the kind of precision that comes from years of training, not one wasted motion. He checked my pulse, my temperature, even my pupils, murmuring what he was doing under his breath like I was something fragile he couldn't afford to mishandle. I kept thinking I should be crying, or screaming, or asking for my wheelchair, demanding to go home, whatever home even meant now. But instead, I sat there, numb and exhausted, letting him work. I was wrapped in the flannel shirt he'd given me, my hair still damp from the cold, my skin tingling as warmth started to return to my fingers. "You're in shock," he said, his voice low and even, kneeling in front of me with a small flashlight and a first aid kit. "Your body's doing what it can. You're safe now." Those words cracked something inside me. Not a sob, not a scream, just a quiet, broken sound I didn't realize was mine until he looked up and gently placed his hand over mine. "I need to tell you what happened," I whispered. "You can," he said, "whenever you're ready." I don't know how long I talked. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe an hour. I told him everything. From the first few weeks after the accident when Jason seemed devoted and kind, to the shift, the distance, the size, the growing silence. The moment he took over my business, how passwords stopped working, how meetings moved without me. I told him about Bella, about the wine glasses that weren't mine, about the nights Jason didn't come home, about how my friends disappeared, and the house got quieter, and I stopped recognizing my own life. And then, finally, I told him what happened today. The drive, the way Jason wouldn't look at me, the clearing, the bag, the flashlight, the words, "You're dragging me down." Alex didn't speak while I talked. He just listened, face unreadable, jaw set tight. When I finished, he exhaled slowly, then stood up and grabbed his phone from the counter. "I'm calling someone," he said. "Two people, actually." He stepped into the corner of the room, keeping his voice low but firm. I couldn't hear all of it, but I caught pieces. "Yeah, it's urgent." "No, I'm not exaggerating. She was left in the woods." "Travis." "Left." Then another call. "Laura Chun." "Yes, I remember. Disability abuse and power of attorney fraud. This is exactly her kind of case. Tell her it's Alex Campbell. She'll know the name." When he came back, he knelt beside me again, this time with something steadier in his eyes. "Okay, I've got a guy, Travis. Ex-cop turned private investigator. Smart, quiet, knows how to dig without setting off alarms. He's going to look into the business situation, the accounts, everything Jason's touched." I nodded slowly, barely breathing. "And Laura Chun," he added, "is a lawyer I worked with after my last deployment. She specializes in disability rights, guardianship abuse, all of it. She's the real deal. She's already expecting your call." It didn't feel real. Nothing did. I was sitting on a couch in a stranger's flannel, in a cabin I'd never seen before, with my ex-boyfriend from college quietly rebuilding my life around me. But for the first time in months, I wasn't frozen. I wasn't alone. Someone believed me. Someone was doing something. Alex reached over and poured me a cup of tea. He didn't rush me. He didn't push. He just sat with me while the kettle hissed, and the fire popped, and my breath slowly started to come easier. I wasn't okay. Not yet. But I was safe. And we had a plan. The camera was balanced on a stack of old books, pointed straight at me. The soft lamp behind it diffused with a thin t-shirt Alex had draped over the shade to cut the glare. He stood off to the side, silent, arms folded, eyes steady on mine, not in judgment, but in quiet support. My hands were resting on a wool blanket draped over my lap, fingers laced together to keep them from shaking. I took a breath and hit record. "My name is Grace Sanders. I am 33 years old. I'm an interior designer based in Seattle. 14 months ago, I survived a car accident that left me paralyzed from the waist down. Since then, I have been emotionally and financially abused by my husband, Jason Sanders." I kept my voice calm, not rehearsed, just steady. I had thought I might cry, but I didn't. Maybe I had already done all my crying in the weeks leading up to that moment. I spoke clearly, carefully, outlining the timeline. How he slowly isolated me from my friends, from work. How he convinced me to hand over control of my company under the guise of helping. How he stopped consulting me on decisions, removed my access to accounts, and ultimately began presenting my business as his own. I explained how he used my name, my clients, my portfolio, while I sat in a wheelchair in the same house we had once built together, no longer allowed into meetings, no longer part of anything. And then I told them about the forest. How he drove me miles outside the city, left me with a flashlight, a bottle of water, and a blanket, and said, "You're dragging me down." How he looked me in the eyes and drove away. "I don't want revenge," I said near the end, my voice still even. "I want my name back. I want what's mine. I want people to know the truth." I ended the video with the time and date, just like Laura had advised, then turned to Alex and nodded. He walked over and quietly shut off the recording. Less than an hour later, Laura had the footage. She watched the whole thing in silence during our video call, her expression unreadable until the very end, when she finally said, "That was perfect. You did exactly what you needed to do." By that evening, she had filed an emergency petition with the court. It was fast, surgical. She asked the judge to freeze all business assets tied to Sanders Interiors, to issue a restraining order preventing Jason from coming within 500 feet of me, and to restore access to all original business accounts and documentation until a full hearing could be scheduled. She flagged the situation as high risk, citing medical dependency, financial coercion, and abandonment. Meanwhile, Travis was already working in the background. He wasn't what I expected. I pictured someone slick, maybe arrogant. Instead, when he called me on Alex's phone, his voice was low and methodical. "Grace, I've been digging. And it's worse than we thought." He had found internal transfers from company funds to Jason's personal account dating back almost 9 months. He'd used the business to fund a weekend trip to Aspen, one Grace Sanders never attended. Bella's name showed up on hotel records. There were invoices signed with my digital signature that I never authorized, one of them to a high-end client I hadn't worked with since before the accident. Forgery, misappropriation of business funds, unauthorized use of intellectual property, Travis said, almost like he was reading a list. "I'll get you everything. Paper trails, screenshots, timestamps." He's been sloppy. I sat there, listening, the words swirling around me like smoke. I should have felt anger, rage, vindication. But instead, I just felt tired. So tired. Still, I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Thank you." Alex hung up the phone when the call ended and knelt beside me again. "We're doing this," he said quietly. "We're going to make sure he doesn't get away with any of it." And for the first time since that day in the forest, I believed it. The damage had already been done. But now, finally, the counterattack had begun. The first time I saw his face on television, I felt like I was watching a stranger playing a role. There he was, in a crisp navy blazer he hadn't worn since our last anniversary dinner, sitting across from a local news anchor with a practiced look of grief plastered across his face. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his eyes damp but dry enough to keep control, and his voice low and carefully broken. "She's been gone for 2 days now," he said, his lips trembling just enough to look real. "I'm devastated. I just want Grace to come home." I sat in Alex's cabin, staring at the screen in disbelief. My tea had gone cold in my hands. Laura had warned me he would try something like this. "He'll spin it," she had said. "He has no idea what's coming." And he didn't. He leaned into the camera like he was reaching out to the public, the grieving, desperate husband. "She was struggling after the accident," he said. "Emotionally, I mean. It was hard for her. I did everything I could. I loved her." Alex had to mute the volume because I started laughing. Not loudly, not bitterly, just a small, stunned sound I didn't know how else to release. Less than 24 hours later, everything collapsed. The police, acting on a sealed court order from Laura's emergency filing, raided the Sanders Interior's office. Jason wasn't there when they arrived. He was probably doing another interview, but Bella was. She'd been working at my old desk, the one I picked out myself from a reclaimed woodshop in Bellingham. She didn't even have time to grab her purse before they asked her to step away from the computer. Travis had prepared everything in advance. They knew exactly where to look. The emails weren't buried. Jason hadn't even bothered to use a burner account. It was all there in his work inbox, drafts, sent messages, even flagged folders. Correspondence between him and Bella titled things like contingency planning and timeline options. One thread in particular, dated 2 months ago, was subject line, justifiable loss. In that email, Jason had written, "If it happens while traveling, weather will be a factor. Maybe a fall, maybe exposure. Hard to prove anything without a witness. It'll be seen as tragic, but not suspicious." Bella responded minutes later. "The forest idea makes the most sense. Distance gives us time." There were attachments, notes, a proposed sequence of actions, a list of supplies. They even discussed which news outlets would be most sympathetic, how to frame it as a story of a woman who gave up on herself and a husband who never stopped loving her. And it wasn't the only plan. There were multiple drafts, multiple versions of my end. One involved a fire. One mentioned an accidental overdose, with vague references to medications and mental health struggles. One chilling bullet point simply read, "If she's gone, business becomes mine completely." The mask he had worn in interviews didn't just slip, it shattered. The police released a statement the next morning. A spokesperson confirmed that Jason Sanders was under investigation for attempted fraud, conspiracy to commit abandonment of a vulnerable adult, and possible charges related to financial exploitation. They didn't mention the emails directly, but every major outlet picked up the leak. Screenshots were already circulating before noon. That same afternoon, I received a message from my former assistant, one of the only people from the office who'd stuck by me. It was short. "You were right. I'm so sorry." I didn't answer right away. I just sat there, the sunlight catching dust in the air as it filtered through the cabin window, and stared at the fire burning low in the hearth. For over a year, he had convinced the world I was broken, that I was a burden, that he was some saint carrying the weight of a shattered woman. Now, the world could see who had really done the breaking. They arrested him on a Tuesday. It was raining, of course. Seattle never misses the chance to cast itself in a dramatic mood, and I watched the footage from Alex's phone as we sat in the back corner of a quiet cafe near the courthouse. Jason didn't resist. He didn't say a word as 2 officers led him out of his office in handcuffs, his coat still unbuttoned, his hair damp and messy like he hadn't seen it coming. His face was pale, his mouth pressed into a thin line, and for the first time, there was no charm in his expression. No performance, just something hollow. The charges were stacked high and fast: attempted murder by abandonment, conspiracy to commit fraud, financial manipulation of a vulnerable adult, and unlawful business practices. Laura called it clean, but devastating. His lawyers tried to negotiate, of course. They pushed the narrative that he panicked, that his actions were desperate, not criminal, that what he did was cruel, but not violent. But the emails were there. The financial records were there. And I was there. The trial began 2 months later. I remember wheeling into the courtroom, wearing a blazer that used to hang a little looser before the accident. My hair was tied back, my hands folded carefully in my lap, and I kept my face calm even though every inch of that building made my stomach twist. He was already seated at the defense table when I came in, dressed in a navy suit I had bought him 2 Christmases ago. He didn't look at me. Not once. The courtroom was quiet during my testimony. I told them about the accident, about the recovery, about the way Jason slowly took control of the business, and then my life. I spoke clearly, without shaking. I told them about Bella, about the isolation, about the night he sent me a message saying, "There's a surprise tonight," about the forest, the bag, the words he said before he walked away. He looked me in the eyes and said, "You're dragging me down." Then he got in the car and drove off. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was tired of bleeding in front of people who once doubted me. This time, I wanted them to hear me without pity, just truth. And then Alex took the stand. He spoke simply, directly, told the jury where he was, what he saw, and how his instincts told him something wasn't right. He described how he followed them from a distance, how he watched Jason unload me, leave me alone, and disappear into the night without looking back. He told them how he found me, shaking, alone, in the dark. The defense tried to paint him as a bitter ex, but Alex didn't rise to it. He didn't even flinch. He told them he hadn't seen me in over a decade, that he had no stake in this except for doing the right thing. And when they asked him why he got involved at all, he said, "Because I knew what I was watching was wrong, and no one else was going to stop it." That silence in the courtroom? That wasn't pity. It was horror. The prosecution closed with a line I'll never forget. This man didn't just abandon his wife. He tried to erase her, emotionally, financially, and ultimately, physically. What he failed to understand is that Grace Sanders refused to disappear. It took the jury less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. When the judge read the verdict, Jason didn't move. He sat there, staring at nothing, like maybe he was still trying to figure out how it had all slipped out of his hands. No one hugged him. No one stood up for him. Even Bella had disappeared from the picture weeks before, refusing to testify. He was taken into custody that afternoon, pending sentencing. I didn't speak to the press. I didn't want the cameras. I just let Laura walk beside me as we exited the courthouse, and when we reached the sidewalk, I looked up at the sky. The rain had stopped, and for the first time in a long, long time, I felt the sun on my face again. It's been 6 months since the trial ended. The days don't feel like borrowed time anymore. I wake up in the morning with purpose, not just to get through the day, but to do something with it. The cabin isn't mine, not really, but Alex still keeps the front step cleared for my chair and the kitchen stocked with peppermint tea, because he knows that's how I start my mornings. We're not a couple, and I'm grateful for that. He's not trying to fill a space. He's just here, and that's more than enough. I moved back into the city 2 months ago, into a 1-story workspace loft in Capitol Hill with wide doorways and countertops I can actually reach. The space used to be a photography studio, full of windows and old floorboards that creak when you roll over them just right. It's not perfect, but it's mine. That's where I started Access first. I'd spent so long thinking about everything that went wrong, how the systems failed me, how silence protects abusers, how hard it is to claw back dignity once it's been taken. I didn't want revenge, and I didn't want pity. I wanted prevention. I wanted to make sure that the next woman sitting in a wheelchair didn't feel like she was invisible inside her own story. Access first began as a consulting firm for businesses trying to make their spaces more inclusive. I used my design background, my experience, and a whole lot of brutal honesty. I told them what it felt like to be treated like an afterthought. I helped remodel lobbies, rethink restrooms, rewrite policies. But over time, it grew into something more. We started offering workshops on disability rights. We partnered with Laura and her firm to give legal advice to clients who didn't even know they had options. We worked with shelters, with advocacy groups, with survivors who'd been trapped not just by circumstances, but by architecture, by assumptions, by fear. We got attention. The good kind. I had my name on the door again. Not Jason's. Mine. And as for Alex, he never once asked for credit. He didn't stand beside me like a hero. He stayed in the background, building ramps, fixing printers, watching the door when I needed space to breathe. He still disappears sometimes, into the woods for a few days, needing quiet. And I let him. Because we're not saving each other. We're just holding the line when the other needs rest. There are still nights when I wake up from the cold, and memories sneak up on me before I can chase them back. Sometimes I dream of the forest, the sound of an SUV door closing, the faint crunch of tires on gravel. But these moments are over. I have something to hold on to. Not a man. Not a business. The mission. I don't know what tomorrow looks like. But I know who I am again. And I will not disappear. The trees hadn't changed. They still stood tall and silent, shrouded in moss and shadow, their trunks wet with the same soft rain that had fallen the night he left me here. The air smelled of pine and cold stone, and the gravel crunched under my wheels just as I remembered. But this time I wasn't in a wheelchair. I got out of the passenger side, breathing slowly, carefully, clutching the cane in my left hand. My legs were still unsteady, but I could walk. Not far, not fast, but far enough. I didn't tell anyone I was coming back here, not even Alex. This moment was mine. I walked along the faint edge of the trail until a clearing opened up. It looked smaller now, less mythical. The log I'd sat on that night was still there, slightly rotting at the base, the moss thicker. I stood there for a while, just listening to the wind move the branches. It was so quiet here that my heartbeat seemed loud. This is where he left me. Here he decided that he didn't need me. Here he measured my value by how much easier his life would be without me. This was the grave he chose for my spirit and perhaps, if he had his way, for something more. But he didn't. I ran my hand along the handle of my cane, grounding myself. I did not come back here to forgive. I did not come here to pity. I came here to look at it with clean eyes. I came to remember. Because it was not here that I broke down. This was the place where I started. It was the place where the mask fell, where the truth came out of the shadows, where the silence cracked and the power found its voice. This is where Alex found me, where I found myself, where the lie ended and my life finally began, for real. I turned away from the clearing and went back to the car. No tears, no fear, only the sound of my cane tapping gently on the ground, step by step, confidently and without fear. Thank you for reading my story. I know it was hard. I know it was not easy. But maybe that's the point. Maybe it's not supposed to be easy.